He paid barely anything for a rusted old water turbine behind an abandoned mill, a hulking relic everyone in town said belonged in the scrapyard. Caleb Morgan, a 59-year-old small-town realtor just trying to stay afloat, thought he was buying a hopeless project. Beside him was Rocky, his loyal German shepherd, quietly watching, as if sensing there was more buried in that metal than anyone. But hidden inside that corroded metal was a forgotten engineering system so clever, so powerful, it would one day save the town from wildfire, restore its water supply, and revive a community on the brink of collapse. What began as a joke at his expense became the discovery that healed old wounds, humbled a wealthy rival, and opened the door to a love he thought he'd lost forever. Before the story unfolds, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? A thin morning mist drifted above the creek where the old mill once stood, softening the broken boards and rust-bitten metal like a memory refusing to fade. Caleb Morgan, at 59, stood at the edge of the abandoned property with his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He was a tall, lean man with weathered cheeks shaped by decades of wind and sun, and a salt and pepper beard trimmed close to his jaw. His gray-blue eyes carried both the calm wisdom of a man who had walked through hardship, especially the financial collapse years earlier that had nearly cost him his home, and the gentle stubbornness of someone who never quite learned how to stop believing in possibilities. Caleb worked as a real estate broker for most of his adult life, guiding families through homes with a patience that disarmed even the hardest skeptics. Yet beneath his easy smile lived a quiet ache, the kind that came from loving a woman he had lost too early, and from raising himself emotionally after grief hollowed him out. His kindness was not weakness. It was armor forged through adversity. At his side sat Rocky, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sturdy frame, thick black and tan coat, and a right ear nicked from an old rescue training accident. Rocky's amber eyes were bright and serious, always scanning, always assessing. Unlike many dogs his size, he moved with controlled grace, as if every step were part of a memory he took care not to disturb. Caleb had adopted him after Rocky's retired search and rescue unit disbanded, and the dog's loyalty had since hardened into something almost uncanny, an intuitive bond, a sense that Rocky understood Caleb's hopes long before Caleb dared voice them. Caleb tugged at his field jacket, clearing his throat as the county maintenance man, Harold Briggs, shuffled toward him. Harold, a short man in his late 60s, with a belly shaped like a half-deflated barrel and a face lined with sunspots, pushed his cap up with 2 stubby fingers. "So you're the one buying this chunk of nonsense?" he muttered. His voice always sounded like he'd spent a lifetime arguing with tractors. Caleb offered him a small, unbothered smile. "Depends on what you call nonsense," Harold snorted. "That thing?" He jabbed a thumb at the rusted hydraulic turbine half buried under weeds. "Looks like someone abandoned a metal carcass mid-chew." The turbine was massive, its main wheel frozen, its paddles bent, its heavy housing split at one seam. Rust bloomed across its surface like a sickness that had set in decades ago. Yet even beneath all that decay, Caleb sensed shape, structure, something dormant but not dead. A machine like this once fed power to the mill, turning rushing stream water into steady force. And maybe, just maybe, it could do something again. When he had heard it was being sold for scrap at a price barely higher than a night in a motel, something in him had flickered to life, the same feeling he got when he entered forgotten houses, old farmsteads with sagging porches, peeling paint, but foundations that still whispered stories. He always believed anything built with intention still held a spark of resilience, perhaps because he wanted to believe the same about himself. Rocky sniffed around the turbine, tail slowly sweeping the air. He gave a soft, low bark, the kind he used when he found something interesting during training. Caleb chuckled. "See? Even he knows it's got potential." Harold groaned. "Your dog's being polite. This hunk ain't run since Reagan." But Caleb had already decided. Papers were signed, money exchanged, and within an hour, a couple of scrappers using an old winch truck began hauling the turbine toward Caleb's home on the outskirts of town. Word spread faster than wildfire in a dry canyon. By the time Caleb stopped by the general store for nails and spare bolts, he heard the first burst of laughter. Caleb Morgan bought the mill's dead heart. What's next? Bottling creek water flavored with tetanus? He finally lost it, bless him. Caleb simply nodded, paid for his things, and left, though the jeers clung to his back like burrs. Rocky walked stiff beside him, ears tilting toward any voice raised too loudly. But mockery, Caleb had learned, was lighter than loneliness and far lighter than regret. Later that afternoon, when the turbine was deposited onto the patch of earth beside his shed, he stood back and studied it under the fading gold of the sun. Its brokenness was undeniable, but so was the hum inside him, that intuitive pull. Something told him this old thing was not finished. While Caleb tied down a tarp, a woman paused across the road in front of the small-town library. Grace Bennett, 60 years old, slender, with long silver-streaked hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, watched with an expression halfway between dismay and curiosity. Her hazel eyes, warm but guarded, reflected the softness of someone who had once loved deeply and lost quietly. Widowed for nearly 10 years, she filled her days managing the library and her evenings tending aromatic herbs on her porch. She had a gentle humor, the kind that didn't try to be heard, only felt. "Buying a new lawn ornament?" she called teasingly from across the street. Caleb laughed softly. "Something like that." Grace walked closer, hands tucked into the pockets of her olive cardigan. She studied the machine with a thoughtful tilt of her head, then glanced at Caleb. "Whatever you're planning, you look like a man who isn't doing this for show." Rocky trotted up to her, sniffing gently, tail wagging as she scratched between his ears. "Well, he approves," she said. "That's the best endorsement I can get," Caleb replied. Grace hesitated, her eyes drifting back to the turbine. "But, Caleb, it looks like it's been through a war." "So have I," he murmured, before he could stop himself. She, though, looked at him then, really looked, and he saw the flicker of understanding in her gaze. "Just be careful," she said softly. As she walked away, Caleb felt the oddest surge of strength, like someone had placed a warm hand at the center of his back. He turned to Rocky. "Well, partner, looks like it's just you, me, and this thing." But Rocky suddenly stiffened, ears rising, nose pointed toward the turbine. He gave one sharp, uneasy bark. Caleb frowned. "What is it, boy?" The turbine sat silent, cold, unmoving, yet something about Rocky's posture prickled the hair on Caleb's arms. It was as if the dog sensed something inside the metal, something hidden, something waiting. And for the first time, Caleb wondered, had he bought more than just a forgotten machine? The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a faint metallic echo that didn't belong to the breeze. Rocky growled, and the chapter ends, not with certainty, but with a question trembling in the air like a wire touched by unseen hands. By late afternoon, the sun leaned low behind the ridge, turning the creek into a ribbon of brass and shadow as Caleb Morgan loosened the collar of his worn flannel shirt and knelt beside the turbine. The machine still loomed like a sleeping beast, huge, dented, splotched with bruise-like rust patches, but he no longer saw it as a ruin. Now, after Rocky's strange reaction the night before, he felt the machine waiting, almost listening. Caleb slid his gloves on, braced his palms against the cold housing, and began scraping rust with steady, rhythmic strokes. Every scrape loosened not only flakes of corrosion, but faint memories of who he had once been, a man who trusted his instincts, a man who hadn't let grief dim his appetite for possibility. Rocky lay nearby at first, alert but relaxed, his thick black and tan tail sweeping the ground. The 6-year-old German shepherd had always been good at settling into the rhythm of Caleb's days, his watchfulness turning the small yard into something safe and familiar. But today Rocky's posture shifted. He lifted his head, nose twitching sharply. Without a sound, he trotted to the corner of the turbine's base where weeds grew in a wiry patch. He pawed, snorted, then dug with sudden purpose as if the earth were hiding words he wanted Caleb to hear. Caleb set aside his scraper. "What have you got, buddy?" Rocky's claws scraped metal. Then, with a grunt, he gripped something between his teeth, a curled leather tube, brittle but intact, capped with tarnished brass. The dog patted over and dropped it proudly at Caleb's feet. "Well, that's new," Caleb murmured, heart kicking with surprise. He brushed off dirt, revealing a faded manufacturer's stamp, Mill Creek Hydro Cone 1938. Carefully opening the leather wrap, he unrolled a set of blueprints, age-wrinkled, ink-smudged, but unmistakably intact. Drawn in neat hand-ruled lines was a network of water channels, including a narrow underground spillway that looped beneath the hill and fed toward the valley's fields. Rocky huffed softly, as if he understood the significance. Before Caleb could study the details, a soft voice floated across the yard. Should I be worried that you and your dog are digging up relics like archaeologists? Grace Bennett stepped through the gate, brushing a stray strand of silver-streaked hair behind her ear. She wore a simple long coat the color of warm clay and carried a small stack of books tied with twine. At 60, she had a gentleness that didn't fade with age, and her hazel eyes always held equal parts caution and curiosity. Caleb smiled. He found this. He held out the leather tube. Grace leaned close, squinting with librarian precision. A blueprint case? From the mill? She whistled softly. That's oddly serendipitous. Or fate, Caleb said before he could stop himself. Her lips curved. Careful. You're sounding like the romantic lead of a small-town mystery novel. I'm trying to avoid cliches, he said. Good luck, she replied dryly, then added, May I look? Together they spread the fragile sheets across the hood of Caleb's truck. Rocky sat between them, tail thumping occasionally, as if he enjoyed the rare sight of two humans united in meaningful confusion. Grace traced a narrow line with her fingertip. This is an auxiliary water route. The mill used it to regulate overflow or redirect power during seasonal shifts. She looked up, eyes brightening with that quiet spark she rarely showed. Caleb, if this exists underground, the turbine might have been more advanced than people assumed. Caleb felt the old thrum of excitement stir in his chest. Meaning, Grace said, tapping a smudge notation. You may have stumbled onto a design that allowed water to be diverted when the creek ran low. A second intake, a fallback system. Caleb laughed under his breath. A backup heart, Grace smirked. Be careful. That metaphor is almost poetic. It's the company I'm in, he said, glancing at her. She pretended not to notice, and failed, judging by the hint of color warming her cheeks. They spent the next hour examining bolts, cleaning joints, and debating torque values with half-serious enthusiasm. Caleb's voice softened whenever he explained structural details. Grace countered with technical references from engineering books she had cataloged over the years. They teased like old friends, but beneath their laughter pulsed a fragile brightness neither dared name. The smell of oil, old metal, and creek wind wrapped around them like an accidental closeness. Sometime near dusk, a pickup rumbled to a stop at the curb. A tall, heavy-set man climbed out. His name was Marvin Red Holloway, a part-time handyman with a reputation for being both helpful and hopelessly blunt. Red was in his early 70s, shoulders broad from years of hauling lumber, his face a brick-wall square with deep-set brown eyes and a crooked nose that had clearly been broken once, probably in his wild youth. His thick white beard gave him the look of a gruff pioneer who had misplaced his horse. Caleb lifted a hand. Evening, Red. Red crossed his arms, staring at the turbine like it had insulted his mother. Heard you bought the old mill's leftover guts, he grunted. Caleb nodded. I did. You out here saving history or losing your mind? Bit of both, Caleb said lightly. Red's brow twitched. Well, rumor is going around the feed store that you're trying to start a miniature power plant. He eyed Grace for a moment, then added dryly, and apparently you have got a librarian accomplice. Grace folded her arms, lifting her chin. I prefer the term informed conspirator. Red snorted, but something amused flickered behind his gruff exterior. He approached Rocky, who rose and sniffed politely. Red scratched the dog's head. At least someone around here's got sense. Then Red leaned closer to the turbine, squinting at the cracked housing. If you're serious about this thing, and I ain't saying you should be, I know a fellow who worked at the mill before it shut down. Old Hank McGuire. He's cranky as a rusted hinge, but he knows things. Might help if you ask nice. Grace frowned. Where does he live? Red jabbed a thumb toward the hills. Trailer past the ridge, can't miss it. Looks like it was built by a man betting on gravity losing the war. Caleb nodded gratefully. But when he turned back to thank Red properly, the handyman was already limping toward his truck, muttering something about fools and their projects. Grace gathered the blueprints, smoothing them gently. You should talk to this Hank. People who worked in places like this, they remember details the rest of us never notice. Caleb agreed, but an unease tugged at him. Rocky's behavior from earlier lingered in his thoughts. The dog now paced slowly around the turbine with a cautious, investigative air, ears pricked as if he sensed something still hidden. Grace noticed too. He's uneasy, she whispered. Yeah, Caleb replied, like something's inside. Inside the turbine? He didn't answer, not because he lacked words, but because a chill rippled through him at the thought. They stood quietly for a moment. The sky darkened. A gust of wind swept the yard, nudging the turbine gently. Something within it clinked, a metallic knock, faint but deliberate, unmistakably not caused by wind. Rocky froze, muscles coiled. His growl rose low and steady. Grace's breath hitched. "Caleb, what was that?" He stepped toward the machine, heart pounding not with fear, but with an eerie certainty that something long forgotten had found its voice again. And as the air thickened, as Rocky pressed protectively against his leg, Caleb whispered the only question that made sense. "Grace, what if this machine isn't just broken? What if it's trying to tell us something?" The last rays of daylight slipped away before she could answer. The drought settled over the valley like a slow tightening fist, its grip turning the once lively creek into a reluctant trickle. Dust clung to every surface, roof shingles, fence posts, and even the turbine itself, giving the old machine a ghostly pallor beneath the late afternoon sun. Caleb Morgan wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, feeling the kind of dry heat that didn't simply warm the skin, but crawled into the bones, urging surrender. For days, he and Rocky had worked from dawn to dusk, cleaning out debris from the hidden spillway, inspecting corroded couplings, and installing makeshift piping that he bought secondhand. His hands were cracked, his fingernails rimmed with rust, and he moved with a stiffness that betrayed both age and determination. Yet beneath the physical strain lurked a deeper exhaustion. The mental weight of knowing the entire town whispered his name with equal parts amusement and concern. Rocky patted the yard in tense strides, glancing at the turbine every few seconds, as if expecting it to betray them. His coat had grown duller from dust, and his ears twitched sharply at each unexpected noise. Old instincts, search and rescue instincts, never quite slept. Caleb crouched by the lower intake valve, turning a wrench until his aging wrist trembled. He grumbled, "Either I'm getting too old for this, boy, or this thing's getting heavier every day." Rocky didn't answer, of course, but he pressed his body against Caleb's leg in a grounding gesture. Caleb smiled faintly and ruffled the dog's neck fur. Grace Bennett arrived moments later, carrying a canvas bag of iced tea and tools. She wore a loose pale green blouse, simple dark slacks, and sturdy shoes dusted from the walk over. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned messily at the back, a style that always made her look like someone who forgot she was beautiful. Her hazel eyes reflected the day's heat, and something gentler, concern. "You look like you're negotiating with a dragon you're not sure you can tame," Grace said as she set the bag down. Caleb exhaled. "If dragons leaked water and groaned every time you touched them, that'd feel about right." She knelt beside him, her movements careful but competent. "Let me guess, you didn't drink anything today?" "I took a sip." "Caleb, a sip is what a cactus offers on a bad day." He chuckled, despite the heaviness pressing on him. Grace scanned the dry creek bed and the sun-seared grass. "This heat isn't normal. Wells are drying up. Even the library's water cooler sputtered this morning." Her voice lowered. "People are scared." Before Caleb could respond, the hum of a large vehicle cut through the quiet. A glossy black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb, too shiny, too polished for a place dusted in drought. The door swung open and out stepped Douglas Pierce. Douglas, 55, was the type of wealthy investor who dressed like he owned the sunlight, tall and tall. Broad-shouldered, he had slicked-back dark hair, lightly streaked with silver, deep-set gray eyes that rarely blinked with warmth, and a clean-shaven jaw that made his expression sharp. His suit, charcoal, tailored, expensive, belonged to someone who viewed manual labor as folklore rather than activity. Behind his composed exterior lurked ambition, sharpened by a recent, very public business failure, one that left him hungry to prove he still had power. He approached with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Caleb, Grace, still wrestling with your scrap heap?" Caleb straightened slowly, trying to give it a second chance. Douglas clasped his hands theatrically. "You're a sentimental man. That's admirable, but inconvenient." He glanced at the turbine with mild disgust. "That machine will never work. The town needs reliable development, a resort, new jobs, tourists, not whatever this hobby is." Grace stepped forward, folding her arms. "Funny. I didn't realize you were appointed spokesperson for everyone's aspirations." Douglas smirked. "I'm simply offering solutions." Caleb forced his jaw to unclench. "We're fine, Douglas." "Are you?" Douglas asked softly. Because from where I stand, that turbine is a hazard and an eyesore. Sell me the land, Caleb. Let's give the valley something real. Rocky growled, not loudly, but enough to slice through the tension. Douglas lifted an eyebrow. Your dog seems to have opinions. He's a good judge of character, Caleb said. The investor's grin thinned, then vanished entirely. Think about it, he said before turning back to his SUV. Before that thing collapses on you. As Douglas drove off, Grace muttered, If arrogance were water, we'd be out of the drought by sundown. Caleb tried to laugh, but something inside him twisted. He's wrong, right? She touched his arm gently. He's impatient, not right. There's a difference. But doubt lingered like a thorn beneath skin. That night, after Grace left, Caleb checked the turbine one last time. Rocky stayed close, unusually alert. The air was dry and brittle, each breath tasting of dust. The sky had turned the color of old parchment when Caleb finally locked the shed and headed inside. But Rocky froze halfway up the steps, ears snapping forward. A moment later, Caleb heard it too. Metal tapping against metal. He spun toward the turbine. Nothing moved. The wind was still. Rocky barreled down the steps and sprinted toward the machine, barking furiously. Caleb ran after him. The turbine shuddered once, then a sharp crack echoed through the yard. Water exploded from the lower seam, spraying in wild arcs. Caleb shielded his face as the turbine's main pin shot out like a bullet, clanging against the fence. The entire right side half of the trunnion sagged dangerously. Someone pulled the retaining bolt, Caleb shouted over the chaos. Rocky barked, nose. Pressed to the ground near fresh boot prints, unfamiliar ones, deep from hurried steps. Caleb shut off the intake valve, but half the trunnion was ruined. His chest deflated. We're done, boy. We're finished. Rocky whined softly, refusing to accept defeat. He nudged Caleb's leg, then trotted briskly toward the tree line, turning back as if insisting Caleb follow. Confused but desperate, Caleb did. They descended toward the hidden spillway entrance the blueprints described. Rocky led confidently, nose to the soil, occasionally glancing at Caleb for reassurance. At the edge of the thicket, they found it, an old stone-lined channel buried under vines. The air smelled cooler here, damp with forgotten potential. Inside the narrow tunnel, Rocky barked sharply. Caleb stepped in, squinting through the dimness. A secondary valve, small but intact, sat recessed into the wall. Next to it lay an old bearing assembly, dusty but usable. Caleb laughed breathlessly. A backup system. Rocky, you genius. They worked until moonrise, patching what they could, replacing what had failed, coaxing the turbine into a fragile whir. Grace arrived near midnight with lanterns and steady hands. She took one look at Caleb's exhausted face and said quietly, Don't let their doubt decide your pulse. The machine sputtered, coughed, then spun weakly, alive but unpredictable. The water pressure flickered between strong surges and weak, erratic pulses. Something was still wrong, something deeper. But the night was too thin, their strength too drained to face it yet. Caleb sat back in the dirt, hands shaking. Grace handed him water. Rocky lay beside them, breathing hard but proud. Caleb whispered, Whoever sabotaged it, they'll come back. Grace looked at the turbine's unsteady rotation and shivered. And whatever is causing that pressure jump, it isn't finished revealing itself. They watched the turbine spin, irregular, stubborn, mysterious, its metal groaning like a creature waking in discomfort. Above them, a shadow moved across the ridge. Neither human noticed, but Rocky did. He rose, staring into the darkness, tail stiff. Something, or someone, was watching, and the chapter ends with the night holding its breath. The night arrived too hot, too still, an unnatural hush curling over the valley, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The air tasted metallic, faintly sweet with the warning scent of sap sizzling somewhere it shouldn't. Caleb Morgan stepped onto his porch, Rocky pressed close to his side, and both stared toward the ridge where a thin orange thread shimmered against the darkness. It wasn't dawn. It wasn't sunset. It was fire gathering its courage. Rocky's amber eyes narrowed, tail stiff. He let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of instinct, a warning honed through years of rescue work. Caleb laid a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling tension coil beneath the fur. Easy, boy. We'll know soon enough. He barely finished speaking when the wind changed. A blast of hot air rushed down the valley, stirring dust devils along the creek bed and sending sparks leaping over the ridge like vengeful stars. The faint glow became a violent shimmer, then a rolling crack, timber breaking under heat, echoed like distant thunder. The fire had arrived. Within minutes, smoke pushed into the sky in thick gray columns. Flames licked treetops. A siren wailed from town, one long, mournful cry followed by the dreaded announcement, power grid offline. Without electricity, the town's pumps, alarms, and emergency lights went dead. Caleb felt the panic rise like a tide. He looked at the turbine. Their battered, stubborn patchwork creation was all that stood between the town and disaster. His heart hammered painfully, like a fist inside a cage. Grace Bennett arrived just then, breathless, a scarf covering her nose and mouth. Her eyes, hazel, gentle, terrified, met his. "Caleb," she panted, "the retirement home lost power. Half the residents can't move on their own. Fire's spreading toward them." "I know." He squeezed her shoulder. "We're going to try something reckless." Grace gave a strangled laugh. "Reckless is becoming our shared hobby." Caleb sprinted toward the turbine. The machine stood half-shadowed, half-lit by fire reflecting off its metal. He yanked open the side panel and braced himself. "Rocky, stay close!" Rocky barked once and took position by his feet, ears pinned back against the roar of approaching flames. Caleb adjusted the secondary valve they discovered days earlier, then grasped the main lever with both hands. "If this breaks, we'll flood half the creek," he muttered. "If it holds," Grace finished for him, "we save them." He pulled the lever. The turbine screamed to life with a metallic roar, deep, ancient, defiant. Its blades spun violently, sending shudders through the ground. Water surged down the pipes, forcing air to blast from release vents like the first breath of something resurrected. Lights flickered across the square, emergency lamps blinking awake, powered entirely by the old turbine. He heard the fire crew shouting in surprise. The town center began to glow, not with flame, but with steady, stubborn light. Caleb's chest loosened. "Go," he shouted. "Grace, help the fire crew with the hoses. Rocky and I will sweep the north trail for stragglers." She nodded, wiping tears from her face before the smoke claimed them. "Be careful." Caleb grabbed 2 battery lanterns now powered by the turbine's revival and ran. Smoke curled through the trees like dark serpents. Embers rained down, hissing when they hit patches of wet ground near the creek. Rocky charged ahead, weaving through shadows with the sure-footed grace of a seasoned rescuer. They reached the first bend in the north trail and heard coughing. Rocky bolted toward the sound. Caleb followed, lantern slicing through the smoke until it illuminated 3 shapes, elderly residents from the retirement home. One woman, frail and trembling, leaned against a walker. An older man with a white beard clutched his chest as if afraid his heart would escape. Another woman sat on the ground, disoriented. Rocky nudged the seated woman gently, licking her wrist before barking for Caleb. "You found us," the bearded man wheezed. "Thought we were done." "Not while Rocky's around," Caleb said, voice shaking with adrenaline. "There's a tunnel entrance not far. Cool air, safe walls. Let's move." With Rocky leading the way, they guided the trio down the hillside. Branches cracked behind them, fire advancing like a living creature. The heat pressed against Caleb's back, urging him forward. They reached the old stone spillway, its entrance dark, damp, mercifully untouched by flames. Inside, cool air wrapped around them like a blessing. The elders panted, coughing, but alive. Caleb turned back toward the turbine. A sharp, heavy clang tore through the night, the sound of metal under stress. His pulse lurched. "Rocky, we're not done." When he reached the turbine, Grace was already there, sleeves rolled, coughing from smoke, but still working. The hoses connected to the turbine-fed pump were spraying a wide arc of water across the dry brush near the retirement home, slowing the fire's advance. Town volunteers, faces smudged, eyes determined, had formed a chain, pulling more hoses from an old storage shed. But something was wrong. The turbine's roar faltered, dipping in pitch like a wounded animal. Caleb rushed to the gauges. The pressure was dropping, fast. A shadow moved near the main valve. Douglas Pierce. His expensive suit was streaked with ash, hair disheveled, face glistening with sweat. But what caught Caleb's eye was Douglas's hand gripping the main shutoff wheel. His knuckles were white, his expression twisted. "What are you doing?" Caleb shouted. Douglas flinched, but didn't let go. This isn't safe. It's unstable. I can't let the town rely on this thing. If it fails, it'll destroy everything. I'm trying to stop you before someone gets hurt." Caleb's voice rose, raw. "People are getting hurt. They need this water right now." Douglas's voice cracked, a sound Caleb had never heard from him before. "My brother died in a factory accident because of a pressure valve like this. I can't watch something like that happen again." Rocky stepped forward, growling, not in threat, but in warning. Douglas blinked, looking at the dog as if seeing judgment, or truth. His grip loosened. Grace stepped beside him, voice steady but soft. "Douglas, look around you. That light, that water, they're saving lives. Let go, please." For one suspended moment, firelight and turbine glow flickered across Douglas's conflicted face. Then, slowly, trembling, he released the wheel. The turbine surged again, pressure stabilizing as if sighing in relief. Water blasted through the hoses with renewed force, creating a soaking barrier around the retirement home. Flames hissed, withdrew, then sputtered out in exhaustion. A cheer rose from the volunteers. Grace buried her face in her hands, laughing and crying. Caleb leaned against the turbine, overcome with shaky relief. Rocky placed his paws on Caleb's knees, licking his chin. "You did it, boy," Caleb whispered. "We all did." Yet even in victory, the night held one lingering unease, because beneath the stabilizing pressure, a strange vibration pulsed from deep underground, steady, rhythmic, unknown. Caleb frowned at the gauge. "Grace, the pressure's holding, but something else just woke up down there." Rocky's ears snapped forward, body tensing, and the chapter closed with the fire dying, but a deeper mystery rising. Morning rose slowly through the exhausted valley, painting the smoke-thinned sky in gentle hues of apricot and pearl. The lingering scent of burnt cedar drifted across the creek, but beneath it was something new, coolness, the soft whisper of water flowing steadily through the newly revived channels. Caleb Morgan stood beside the turbine, Rocky leaning against his leg, both of them watching as sunlight glinted across the wheel's damp metal. It looked almost proud, as if aware it had defied every prediction spoken against it. Caleb brushed soot from his sleeves. Every muscle ached, yet a strange buoyancy filled him, like someone had lifted a weight he'd carried so long he forgot it wasn't meant to be permanent. Rocky yawned and nuzzled his arm, tail sweeping the dirt in lazy arcs. "You're a hero, you know that?" Caleb murmured. Rocky tilted his head, accepting the compliment with dignified modesty. A car door slammed in the distance. Grace Bennett emerged from the library steps, her hazel eyes warm despite the long night. Her hair, still smelling faintly of smoke, was loosely gathered in a faded blue ribbon, giving her an air both soft and quietly triumphant. She stopped him beside him. "The town council's gathering in the square. They want you there." "Me? I'm just a man with rust under his nails," Grace smiled. "A man who kept the lights on when the grid fell apart." People gradually filled the square. Neighbors Caleb had watched argue for years suddenly standing shoulder to shoulder. Marion Greeley, the retired teacher whose stern face usually never softened, now waved with unguarded fondness. Old Mr. Conrad, with his bent posture and trembling hands, held a handmade sign painted overnight. "The Tuabans saved us," misspelling and all. Even Douglas Pierce stood among them, shoulders slumped, suit jacket smudged, hair a disheveled memory of the sleek style he'd once guarded. The arrogance that usually stiffened his jaw was gone, replaced by something humbler, rawer. Sheriff Walter Ames, broad-shouldered, weathered from decades on the job, with a silver mustache that seemed carved from mountain stone, stepped onto the makeshift podium. He had always been a calm, steady presence, a man whose patience had grown out of years mediating small-town disputes and the few big griefs that had struck them all. He raised his hand. "Last night wasn't luck. It was grit, brains, and a dog with better instincts than every one of us." Laughter rippled gently through the crowd. Rocky barked once, accepting applause like a seasoned performer. The sheriff continued, voice steady. "We vote today on whether the old mill stays or gets sold off. But after what we witnessed, after that turbine kept our people safe, it's clear what this town truly needs." And just like that, the vote passed, unanimous. The old mill would stay, and in its place would rise the Creekside Center for Water and Memory, a space for education, emergency preparedness, and community gathering, anchored by the turbine that once inspired ridicule. Caleb felt Grace's hand slip into his, quiet but sure. He swallowed hard. "Didn't expect this." "You earned it," she whispered. Douglas cleared his throat and stepped forward. Up close, guilt sat across his face like a bruise, tender and undeniable. Caleb, I owe you more than a simple apology. His voice cracked softly. Last night, I nearly made a terrible mistake. Fear got the better of me. My brother died in a valve explosion years ago. I ran from that memory, not realizing I was letting it poison everything. The square fell silent. Douglas continued. So, I'm donating my land by the creek, all of it. Build your park, make it a memorial for the firefighters who helped us last night. And maybe for the ones no longer with us. Murmurs, shock, then applause, soft at first, then swelling, until Douglas blinked rapidly, humbled by the acceptance he had not expected. Caleb crossed the space between them and offered his hand. Thank you. That means something real. Douglas took it. His grip trembled. By noon, volunteers were already cleaning debris, repairing hoses, and checking on elders who had spent the night in the tunnel. And Rocky, proud, gentle Rocky, walked among them with a calm steadiness that made everyone reach down to stroke his muzzle. Someone suggested he visit the retirement home weekly as a therapy dog. The residents cheered the idea before anyone could object. Grace touched Rocky's head. He'll love that, she said warmly. He'll have more friends than the rest of us combined. Wouldn't surprise me, Caleb replied. Later that afternoon, once the crowds thinned, Grace lingered near the turbine's wheel as it spun steadily. She watched the light reflecting off its metal, the shadows dancing across Caleb's weathered face. He looked younger somehow, not in features, but in spirit. You know, she began, teasing gently, we've spent an awful lot of time together talking about valves and pressure levels. That's practically dating in our age group. Caleb chuckled, but looked oddly nervous. Rocky nudged his leg, urging him on like a patient coach. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a polished brass whistle. It gleamed like it had been carved from a sunbeam. Repurposed from one of the old turbine fittings, he said softly. Took all morning to clean it up. Grace's eyes shimmered. It's beautiful. He stepped closer, voice trembling just slightly. Grace, every machine needs a signal to start. A sound that says it's time for a new cycle, a new beginning. She stared at him, breath caught. He lifted the whistle. May I sound the first call of our next chapter? Grace let out a soft laugh, warm, surprised, filled with something tender. Yes, Caleb, please do. He blew the whistle gently. It sang, a clear, bright note that echoed along the creek bed and glimmered among the trees. The turbine lights flickered in response as if offering their blessing. Grace took his hand. Rocky sat between them, tail thumping, a guardian of this improbable, hard-earned happiness. And as the afternoon sun dipped behind the hills, the town they once feared might crumble stood steadier than ever, rooted in persistence, rebuilt through kindness, and warmed by a love that rose from the ashes when no one expected it. The future shimmered like water, finally finding its course. And the chapter closes on two intertwined joys, one shared by a town and one held between two hearts. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't arrive with trumpets in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, hidden inside an old turbine people once laughed at, or in the steady loyalty of a dog who never gives up on us. And maybe that's one of God's gentlest lessons, that hope can rise from the rusted places in our lives, that strength can be found in the hands of ordinary people, and that His grace often works through the small acts of kindness we choose every day. Just like Caleb, Grace, and Rocky discovered, what others call useless may one day become the very thing that carries light into the darkest night. And perhaps the same is true for each of us. God can turn the simple, the broken, and even the doubted into blessings we never expected. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment with your own story of a quiet miracle, or a moment when God showed up in your life in the most unexpected way. And if you'd like more stories of courage, faith, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. May the Lord bless you, keep you, and surround your home with His protection and peace. May His grace be with you, now and always. Amen.